Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Black Cultural Archives, to the last of our panels commemorating 40 years since the Brixton Uprisings. Though we refer to it as the Brixton Uprising, of course, there were similar occurrences in other cities and towns such as Toxteth, Handsworth, and Southall, and similar disturbances occurred in 1985. Our first panel was on press and media representation. Our second panel concerned literature and culture, and this panel will look at policing and demands, both at the time and also considering the contemporary moment with Black Lives Matter and community organising around demands to do with policing, but also to do with legal representation. Our host for this evening is Adam Elliott Cooper, who is a research associate in sociology at the University of Greenwich. And he's also author of the book, Black Resistance to British Policing. I will leave him to introduce our panelists, but before that, just to let you know that live captioning is available this evening for those of you who would benefit from enjoying the event that way. We will be posting a URL into the chat, which you will click on, and you'll be able to see the captions and adjust them to your preferred level. So without further ado, I will introduce our chair for this evening, Adam Elliott Cooper, and we'll be on for approximately 1 hour. You could also paste your questions into the chat, and you needn't wait till the end of the event to do so. You can do that as we go along, and Adam will manage that. So over to Adam.
Thank you so much, Aisha, and thank you so much for everyone at the Black Cultural Archives who's put together such a crucial event. I think it's really important that we come together to remember these really vital Black histories of resistance and struggle. I think far too often we reminisce on the histories of racism and suffering, and I think it's uplifting and inspiring for us to come together to talk about those struggles of resistance, those movements for change, and the ways in which those legacies are still with us today. So, of course, today we're talking about some of the most important Black rebellions in British history. And it is very much a living history with us today, despite the fact that it, of course, emerged from a context in which Britain's Black Power movements had changed the racial landscape of the country, articulating a radical revolutionary vision of a different world. These more spontaneous uprisings, which of course began in 1980 in St Paul's, in Bristol, as well as in Nottingham, really took the nation and captured the nation in 1981. And Brixton was, of course, one of the crucial flashpoints for this. And as of course, as I'm sure everyone watching is already aware, these uprisings, although they were sparked by racist policing, the sus laws which harassed and arrested and incarcerated predominantly and disproportionately young Black men on the streets of cities like London and Manchester and Liverpool and Birmingham and Bristol and Leeds. It was also resistance to wider structures of racism, the problems of employment, the attacks on Black community and cultural and youth centres, the Immigration Act, which was using border controls to oppress Black and other racialized peoples. A whole swathe of different forms of racism were the preludes to and the context of these urban rebellions in 1981. And of course, the legacies of them, which I'm sure we're going to talk about as well, is hugely important. Right? We're going to be thinking about what happened not only in 1985, rebellions again in Brixton, but also in Tottenham, but also, of course, how they paved the way for later movements. The campaigns against Black deaths in police custody with organisations such as United Family and Friends campaign. The movement, of course, that has emerged out of many of the youth organisations that exist today, which have built on the youth organisations in previous decades. And of course, we cannot forget the fact that we've seen some of the largest anti-racist mobilisations in British history in the last 12 to 18 months, and thinking about how those young people who took to the streets in the summer of last year were standing on the shoulders of the generation that came before them as well. So we have a really fantastic panel joining us tonight who are going to be talking about those histories and what they mean for us today. One of the first person on our panel is Ross Griffis. She's a senior strategic community engagement lead for local government. She grew up in Brixton and is going to tell us a lot about what it was like to grow up in Brixton as a teenager during those uprisings. And she's worked and volunteered in Lambeth for over 30 years in the voluntary community sector. She holds an MA in community organising and is the former CEO of Southside Young Leaders Academy, a youth charity based in Southwark. She's also a skilled and highly experienced executive manager and with a proven ability to engage positively with a range of deprived groups, raising aspirations of groups and individuals, proactively creating and employing strategies to improve lives. And she's also part of a really fantastic new documentary series directed by Steve McQueen about the uprisings and black movements of 1980 and 1981, from the Black People's Day of Action to the rebellions of 1981. So, and I'm sure she can tell us a bit more about that as well. The second person on our panel is Ife Thompson. Ife is a barrister and community activist who founded the charity Black Learning Achievement and Mental Health. It's an organisation which partners with schools to teach students about Black history, which is, as I'm sure many people are aware, is not currently part of our national curriculum. But Ife is also a fierce advocate of British schools to incorporate honest and unvarnished narratives about the empire and colonialism into their curricula. And she founded the Black Protest Legal with the aim of providing legal support and representation for UK Black Lives Matter protesters. And finally, we have Jasmine Yaboa, a member of the Lost Blocks Collective, a group of young residents living on the Broadwater Farm Estate in Tottenham. Their vision is a future where the community of Broadwater Farm Estate are celebrated for its diverse stories and cultures, and their mission is to change the narratives of Broadwater Farm Estate. The collective is currently designing a series of youth-focused events, starting with the launch of a 12-episode podcast series. So looking forward to hearing about that as well. So Ros, maybe we could begin with you, and maybe you could set the scene for us a little bit. Could you talk to us a little bit about that context of the rebellions of 1981? What was it like to be a young Black person in Brixton in the late 70s and early 80s, experiencing what were then known as the sus laws, the laws of suspicion that the police were using in this time?
For me, growing up in Brixton in the 70s, I would describe my experience as I was very angry as a teenager in terms of how we were treated, people who looked like me, how we were treated. At school, education system, we were treated differently. They had low aspirations for people who looked like me. So we had that issue to contend with. Then we had our parents who had the experience of coming to this country in the 60s, that they were met with discrimination and harassment by the police. They faced discrimination in housing. And so my generation in the 60s, it continued. So 70s, I was very angry, had to navigate around racial slurs, and as early as primary school, continued into my secondary school. So I was very angry as a teenager, why I was treated differently. So there were a lot of people who looked like me, came from the same neighborhood, who were experiencing similar experiences. So we were all angry. But the other side to that, we didn't have much, but we were a very close-knit community, and we were very happy in terms of, you know, coming together in numbers to try and, you know, support each other. So I think that looking back 40 years, I think I was a rebel with a cause. And there were some great personalities in my communities that encouraged me to be the best I can be, and encouraged that I'm smart, and, you know, I can be anything I wanted to be if I focus. But it was, it's telling the system that I'm not my parents. So I wasn't doing Martin Luther King. I was more aligned with Malcolm X. By any means necessary, you're going to feel my frustration. You're going to hear my voice, because change is a must. So there was many young people who felt very strongly that we belong, and we want our voices heard, and we're not going to be pushed around, and we will not change it. We will not turn the other cheek. We will stand. We have a right. So yes, I think that I was fearless. When I look back 40 years, I was fearless. There was nothing that was going to change my view. I think I was resonating a lot with Bob Marley. Stand up for your rights, war, all those, tunes at the time. Because I think that reggae music was part of my staple diet, and it resonated with my feelings at the time. In terms of making a stand for what I believed in. But I started off very young. So to coin the phrase Black Power, I started off as a teenager in the early 70s into the 80s. Black Power. It means that we're standing up for our rights and we're not going to be pushed around and our voices will be heard. So that was my backdrop. So when the fire, New Cross fire, that was a trigger for me because they were my peers, similar age group at the time. And then the Black People's Day of Action, I wanted to be part of it. So there was nothing that was going to stop me from being part of action, I told the teachers at the time, remember that I won't be at school that day because I'm part of the revolution. And I took a stand.
and I feel like historically, those uprisings in 81 are considered to be a real watershed moment in Black British history. Did the world, did Brixton, did your life feel different? Did you feel different after the uprisings?
I think that we got the message through to the government, and that was what it was about. We are frustrated, and that frustration spilled out into the streets. We were frustrated at school. We were frustrated with the system, the police harassment, treated differently, the racial slurs that was on the wall that said, "Keep Britain white." We were frustrated, but we weren't our parents. We were not going to do Martin Luther King that turned the other cheek and sing "We Shall Overcome" and read the 23rd Psalm. For me, I was more aligned with Malcolm X. It was by any means necessary, I'm going to make a stand. And there were so many of us that felt the same way strongly, about making a stand. We're not going to be pushed around, beaten, and harassed, and just turn the other cheek. It just wasn't going to happen. So yeah, it was a standoff.
Wow. And Jasmine, if I could come to you, of course, a few years later, there were another flashpoint was on Broadwater Farm Estate, where you live. Growing up on Broadwater Farm Estate, in what way have those uprisings of 1985, do you think, affected your generation living on that estate and in the area?
I think you always knew about I knew about things that occurred, so the riots that happened on the estate, and there was always that friction between the police officers and us, but the police officer and us always symbolized different race, that race and us, because there was only specific police officers that were coming into the estate. And I think growing up, you just learn that you have to stand up. You hear the stories of what people have been through, even family members, when they were arrested, how they were treated. They were like, and even them, they weren't, just because they were Black, they were associated with the boys that may have been downstairs already, but they could have just been, doing their own thing, going to uni, but they were chilling with their friends. And people might say wrong place at the wrong time, but the way that they were treated by police officers or whatnot it gives you type of not a hatred, but you become very hostile towards certain people already. And that's just growing up in primary school, because I've lived on the estate for such a long time. But I think one thing that you don't learn, that I guess I'm learning now, 26, is how to actually speak up and how to protest and how to stand up against this stuff. And I think it's good because obviously now I'm learning, people have definitely done it before us, but the community is predominantly Afro-Caribbeans and our parents are like the first generation here. And so I love what you said, wasn't you? Like, we're not our parents, which is good. But I think that my generation in the estate are still learning how to fight against those things as well. But we are doing it. We're learning from those before us in different areas, and that is helping us. I hope I've answered your question.
No, of course, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And of course, nothing can maybe indicates more that the younger generation are trying to learn from that history of Black protest than the way in which we've seen a new generation of people, Black community organisations and protests and things like that, Jasmine. And I know you're part of this Lost Blocks collective. Has learning from the generation before us helps you in putting together this collective and the work that you do?
Well, yes, and there's so many. So going talking about the podcast is aimed at us telling our stories, because one thing that we realize is that the story of Brought to Farm, the rights, is always told by people outside who are telling other people what had happened, but we wanted young people or people in the estate to tell their story. So you have people who've been on the estate for a very long time. You have people in education, because there's a school in Brought to Farm headed by a Black teacher. So she's on one of the podcasts. Then you have one of my friends that I grew up with, and we grew up with, like, obviously the boys of the estates and stuff. And she's talking about, she's gone into, policing. She's worked as a police officer, and she talks about her experience on the estate. And so they're really interesting people, and they speak the realities of the farm, but how it's helped us to become the people that we are. I also feel like protesting farm is also done in a different way as well. I feel drill music and the rise of music is protest in a different type of way. It might not be like standing in the streets, but I do feel like when you listen to some of the lyrics of the boys, and people feel like, oh, it's all violence and all of this, they do say stuff that I think that's their way of protesting as well, which people should actually take in. And, the government saying, no, stop drawing that. But that's the way that the boys are telling their stories, because what people don't see is behind the scenes, they also want to help the community. And as residents on the estates, we want those people that can just help us. And we don't see boys, that are downstairs as this gang member or this and that. We actually see them as someone's brother, someone's son. And so we all see each other as a family. Like I see the boys opening the door, carrying people's bags. That's not what they promote on social media. That's not what they promote on media at all. So I hope I'm answering your question, not just going on because I can. But what I'm just trying to say is we are learning, and we're also making new ways to protest with drill music, and also protesting in becoming, going against the stereotypes. And I always say this, there's so many people in Brought to Farm that have good jobs, and I mean really good jobs, bank managers and all sorts, that, that's not promoted. But, even going to university, there's a lot of people that go to university. I worked in different places in a bank, had different roles. And I think just because you don't become what people expect you to become, that in a way is also protesting, because then I want to come back to my community and help those who are there. And I always tell the young people that I work with, because I go to St. Mark's Methodist Church, but the youth that come there are from obviously Tottenham, Edmonton, surrounding areas. And I'm like, you need to learn the lingo, because what we do is we get angry and we actually don't know how to fight a good fight. In your workplace, you can't just get angry at your manager if it's racism or different stuff like that. You have to learn how to talk. You have to learn how to be able to protest in a way that they have to listen to you, and they can't just say, oh, you're rowdy, or you're this, or you're the stigma. And so that's a passion of mine as well, to teach youth and young people how to do it in a way that is correct, and you get your point across effectively.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're saying about rappers being the kind of a form of articulating protest and things today, because I think it really resonates with what Roz was saying, right, about how the philosophers that they were listening to in the 70s and 80s were people like Bob Marley, right, people talking about war, right, and people are talking about war again today, right, they're talking about war, they're articulating the violence that surrounds them, and putting that into an art form that is relatable and digestible and illuminating, I think, and resonates with people who are affected by it and people who aren't. So I think it's interesting how we continue to see those kinds of cultural legacies in Black communities, of utilizing music and culture as a way of articulating resistance and talking about what the issues that are being faced. And Aoife, if I could come to you and maybe talk about education a little bit before we maybe talk about more contemporary issues, because I know that you've also been involved in working on educational projects. Like Jasmine's talked about the podcast and working to kind of thinking about how education can be found in maybe places we don't always look, like in music and those types of things. But you've also been trying to influence our school system, right, and trying to bring these Black histories into our classrooms as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's what Land's been set up to do. That's what we've been working on for the past 3 or 4 years now.
3 or 4 years.
In terms of yes, sorry, continue.
No, it's a long time. And could you tell us a little bit about the kind of curriculums that you guys are constructing or proposing that are introduced into our schools?
Yeah, so at the moment we're doing a lot of grassroots work, because yes, we know that in terms of teaching Black history on the curriculum, this is not a new phenomenon. Like in our communities from as far back as the 50s, 60s, people have been asking for the state to include Black narratives on the curriculum. And then in the 1980s, you had the advent of Black History Month in the UK due to campaigning from the Black community. So in terms of us recognizing the cultural need for our narratives to be on the curriculum, this is a long uphill battle. And, as for me, as someone who's gone through the education system, I've been through it. I know how Eurocentric it is and how exclusionary it is and how it only focuses on US narratives. So when we see Blackness, we only see Blackness in terms of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and that's it. So in terms of narratives that allow us to understand why we are in the UK today, even me, I say that, my grandparents met in Scotland in the 50s because it was a thing for loads of colonial subjects to go to Scotland, particularly Nigerian colonial subjects, to go to Scotland to study. And I never really understood why my grandparents were there because, again, narratives around Blackness haven't been taught properly, particularly when we're looking at the history of empire in this country. So for me, it was the need to undo this Eurocentric sort of curriculum that I had gone through, knowing that I didn't learn anything that actually affirmed my reality. And it wasn't until I got to university I learned about the British Black Panthers. And I said, oh my gosh, what's all this about? I learned about Douglas Howe. I went to go and get his book. And I was really, really moved to see that we had our own movement in the UK, because all I'd ever known was Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, who were amazing, and Angela Davis. I used to listen to them a lot, but it was really affirming to know that we had our own activists in the UK that have told our narrative and been fighting the good fight. So I think for me, knowing that the education system was so exclusionary, it made sense for me to think about what kind of solutions can we bring to this issue. So BLAM was actually at the back of this. We thought about how can we make change? And I think when we first started off, we was doing supplementary schools in the community, continuing that tradition, Jessica and Eric Huntley, supplementary schools and all that kind of community organizing that reaffirms we do for self. Yeah. So I think for me, it started off as doing for self, but we're very much youth-led as well. So the young people said to us, Ife, we love the sessions. These are really good, but we want this to be in a school setting. We don't want to wait till summer to learn about our narratives. So for us, that challenge is think about how can we get into schools. And I always say that even if the state made the teaching of Black history mandatory tomorrow, a lot of teachers will not know what to teach because, again, the workforce is overwhelmingly white. And again, they too have grown up in the Eurocentric education system. And the only reason I've been able to liberate myself and to know more about our narratives is through Black bookshops, like New Beacon Bookshop, which is Britain's first Black bookshop. So those kind of things liberated me. So I think, the work that we do is thinking about what are the current issues that we have and how can we ensure that narratives are more inclusive of Black narratives. So we do teacher trainings as well. So we often go into schools doing a lot of teacher training. And the first thing we hear is that, oh yeah, I want to teach Black history, but I don't know where to start. And I'm like, well, you can start in Africa where all Black people are from, and then let's move out to think about how Black people are kidnapped, taken to the Caribbean, and how did Black people end up in the UK, and think about, those sort of globalized narratives. So for our work, yes, we teach Black British narratives, but we know that Black radicalism and Black liberation is intergenerational, but also transnational. So in terms of our dialogue and our discussions in classrooms, it's transnational. So I feel like Black culture, Black resistance is what shapes our work. So when Jasmine was talking about art as a form of resistance, I was smiling because just today I did a session with young people looking at music as a form of resistance, looking at dub poetry as a form of resistance, and raising consciousness of the community. So all those kind of narratives are things that we tie back in, but we also really affirm Black culture as worthy of inquiry. So what we often find is that Black narratives are completely left out. We are not told about our narratives. So for us, going into school is actually reaffirming the fact that Black people deserve to learn about their narratives in a school space where they are used to learning and where learning is legitimized as well. So I think it's a kind of fighting against institutionalized Eurocentric canon and ensuring that it's inclusive of Black narratives and centering of Black narratives.
And how do you think we can because I guess there's another problem, right, which is trying to make sure that not only do we teach this history, but it isn't a misreading of history, because when I think Jasmine mentioned this. I think Jasmine both mentioned this. Very often when we hear about the history of Broadwater Farm or Brixton, it's not told from the perspective of people from those communities. It's told from an outsider's perspective. How important do you think it is that not only do we have these things introduced into the curriculum, but we make sure that the perspectives that are through which it's introduced ensure that we're not written out of those histories, or we're not misrepresented in them?
Yeah, I think that's vital. I think all that we do at BLAM, the key thing I tell all my staff is that, have you decolonized the story? Whose viewpoint are you telling the story from? And then I had to literally meticulously go through slides and say, okay, where's that from? What language are you using? Why are you using that language? Why is that the norm? And really challenge ourselves to think about how whiteness permeates how stories are told, and particularly thinking about who are these stories serving. So I think it's always remembering to look at things from an Afrocentric point of view, thinking about things from a Black point of view, and ensuring that language that you're using is speaking to Black people, empowering them, and actually honoring Black people. Because all too often we're never honored in our stories. We are constantly demonized. The language that we use is reaffirming whiteness's perceptions of us. So part of Black liberation and the way in which we look at Blackness is about decolonizing that in and of itself. Like even like now we do a lot of work around Black British English. So when I go into school, I told the young people that you're not allowed to call the language you speak slang, because it's a language in and of its own right. And thinking about actually why are certain things called certain things, and why is it that the way Black people express themselves is demonized and said is less than, when, you know, all languages are created by people. So no language is superior. All languages are created for communication, right? So I think it's actually looking at all aspects of Black life and thinking about not just in the way we teach, but also the way we relate to ourselves and things that we create and our cultural production, and thinking about how can we ensure that that's decolonized? How do we change our language? So I'm constantly having to get our staff to read loads of texts, trying to get them to ensure that they too are, you know, speaking life to young people and speaking life to Black creation.
Wow, that's amazing, because I think far too often we only hear I think the phrase decolonizing a curriculum or way of learning is kind of collapsed into just being a diversity initiative, right? Putting some Black faces into the textbooks and maybe some events from Africa or the Caribbean. But I think what's crucial about what decolonization means is that it's about something which is historically constituted, right? So it's better understanding these histories properly, but also it's something which is transnational, right? It's understanding those histories of empire. And I think making sure that we understand that decolonization is something which is political, right? Rather than simply something which is a kind of a bureaucratic tick box exercise, I think is something really fantastic. Jasmine, did you have a hand up? Did you want to contribute something?
I did. I don't know how it, but girl, thank you so much. You couldn't say better. Lost Books Collective. I hope I'm not embarrassing you here, but you know what? I am a primary school teacher. That's my profession, and I started off. And this year, I worked in a school which was predominantly white, and they didn't have Black History Month. They had like 3 Black History evenings, and I was absolutely abhorred. I was so saddened by what they portrayed, how they portrayed, especially African music. Literally, they got village people with leaves around their heads, hopping around, no teeth in their mouths. And I didn't look at the link before because I thought, oh, it's just done. And it was done by a teacher. They have Black teachers in the school, but it was done by a white teacher who put this on. And I had the lesson on a Monday and I looked at it. I literally had to switch it off. And I literally saw my Black students in my class go into their chair like that. I switched it off. I was so angry because I was like, This is what causes the racism. I'm in a classroom, which is not in Tottenham. I've gone out to this school that's Ofsted outstanding, and this is how they're portraying Black people to young children that are, I was teaching 7 to 8 year olds, and one of the children in my class shouted out "ill," like I was saying, this is, I've been to Ghana, and that's not it. Like I'm telling you, and as a teacher, I was so hurt. Like honestly, I was hurt. But it showed me the colleagues I'm working with, because in education, us as Black teachers, we're also going through the systemic racism as well. You know, you're trying to manage it, you know, everything you're going through. Plus, you're trying to get there and be there for the students, but they're sending you like the video. If you see it, I send it to everyone just to see that it wasn't me. Every Black person was appalled. They're like, how could they show this? There's Afro beats, there's all these different, a woman in a village with leaves in her hair, jumping with other people. And I don't know what they were singing with no teeth in their mouth. And that was a portrayal of Black people. And it hurt me more because the students in my class are British, like proper, pure British. They probably don't even have contact with a lot of people. Maybe they do, but I know I've seen their families and stuff. That's what they had, apart from me, of the representation of Black people. So I think it's so important, because schools, we really where the contact that people have. So, you know, that child in my class, I know some of their parents are doctors and lawyers. They're going to grow up and maybe have a position in society. The perception they gain in that classroom is key, because it will influence what they do in the future. And they probably don't mix when they go outside. So I think it's important that we have these curriculum in the classrooms and they allow the right people to teach it the right way. But we also have to know that there's fear from members of SLT who are normally predominantly white, who, like, when they were telling the stories, they weren't talking about slavery. They just showed some athletes. It was done in their way. And that's why they didn't give it to the Black teachers, because they wanted to tell the story their way. But if we want to empower the Black students, we have to tell it the real way. So it's important. And sorry I interrupted, but that's so passionate. I have passion for that. Listen, it's in me. So yeah, thank you.
No, we love that passion, and maybe that tells us more about Ofsted than Ofsted would like us to really consider, given that yes, it's a top Ofsted school with showing those kinds of stereotypical videos. But speaking of videos and the kind of video content that we can use to properly learn some Black British history, I want to come back to you, Roz, because I know you've been involved in quite a groundbreaking documentary recently, which I think really challenges people's perceptions and notions of the Brixton Uprisings and the prelude to it. Can you tell us a little bit about this documentary?
Well, the documentary is telling the story from people who have the lived experience, and that hasn't been done. It's their testimonials. And interestingly, most of us has never met. But if you look at how the stories have been told, you would have thought we sat in one room and decided that we're telling the story, because it's so aligned with our upbringing. That's what's made it so powerful. I talk from Brixton because I grew up there. You know, when you talk to somebody in New Cross, you go, hold on a minute, similar to my experience. Do you know what I mean? Or somebody from Hackney and so on. So I think it's time that when we tell a story, we tell it in our own voices. And, you know, it's from a lived experience, not an opinion. There's nothing wrong with people having an opinion or a theory, but you have to align that with the lived experience. This is our experience. This is how we were treated. This is how we grew up. This is what we did at the time when we were teenagers. I can say that I was aligned with Malcolm X by any means necessary. I was frustrated. I was angry. So I went out and took my frustration to the streets because nobody wanted to hear my voice. And I found other people that were that aligned with how I was feeling. So it just fueled the fire, and it was them and us. And you know, it was amazing. Looking back, I could not believe I was a rebel with a cause. And you know, I was very clear from school that I was an independent thinker, and I wasn't my parents. I had a very clear view on how I was treated, how I felt differently, and how it affected me. There was no one to go to, no one to guide me and say, well, this is how you deal with your feelings. Yes, we had seniors that were very articulate and talking about some, you know, grand stuff around racism. But at the end of the day, I think that if you watch the video, it's going to capture hearts and minds, and it's going to make a few people sit up and pay attention. And there's a lot to learn.
I'm sure there'll be more than just a few. I'm sure we've actually
Yeah.
got a question for you that I think you'll be great to answer, Ross, from the audience. Jay Jagney asks about says that the rebellions have been sorely underrepresented in the narratives told since. But they ask, what can you guys share with us about the experiences, particularly of women, before and during the uprisings? So, for example, because I guess a lot of time we hear about police harassment of young black men, but what were the experiences of women, do you think, during this time specifically?
Women pay, and it's interesting that they raised that. It's a very, very good question, because women, in my experience, played a leadership role. They were not at home cooking and cleaning the houses. They were out there in the front line. My greatest role model was Olive Morris, a black female activist, and she was about housing rights, liberation for black people. So I remember there were supplementary schools because we're too angry to learn anything at school. So we relied on supplementary education. So Saturday schools, they were run usually by women. So they had, and I must mention the black-led churches. Those is where you saw these leaders. They spoke very eloquently. They spoke with clarity and conviction. And they're the ones that were doing the Martin Luther King, we shall overcome, and reading the 23rd Psalm. And they believed they had strong faith. So I saw those kinds of strong women who believed they were strong in their faith. So I think that when we talk about the women's experience, we forget that black churches, led churches, they acted as a community hub. It wasn't, and so there was spirituality. You either went down the Rastafarian route or you went the Christianity route. But there was faith, there was culture, and there was resistance, there was leadership, and there was rebellion. That's why it was about an uprising, because nobody sat and planned it. It was just that, look, somebody's got to give. But I wouldn't be who I am today without these strong characters in my life, both men and women. That's why Brixton is a very special place in my heart, because it's who I am today. It has a lot to do with where I'm coming from. So women, I saw them as leaders, not cooking and cleaning, but they're the ones that sheltered us when we wanted to go out there and fight the cause. They're the ones that took us in. So, when they talk about it takes a village to raise a child, I had many mothers away from my birth mother. So they played a very important role in the whole uprising. They're the ones that talked to us, calm us down, saying, it's going to get better. We were so angry we would have teared down every part of Britain. That's how angry we were. So yes, women were there, front line. They're the ones that saved us, in terms of, so that we didn't go completely down a road of complete destruction.
Yeah, and Jasmine, in your own youth work and teaching and things like that, would you say there are specific issues today that are faced by black women that maybe resonate with what Roz is saying, or might be different to what Roz has experienced historically?
In the community, I would say, obviously black mothers, because maybe there's a lot of single parent mothers. So in particular, in relations to the estate, every time, but then it's everywhere, I guess. Every time like a child dies, like the mother and, having to be strong for the family, having to pay. So you have all of that single parent mothers, there are a lot of them. And so they are the backbone, and, trying to keep their child on that narrow path, on that straight course takes a strength as well. And, they're respected in so many, different ways, trying to even help their children to get onto the right path. So I definitely believe Black mothers have played a big role. And even when you hear people that have changed and they're not, you know, going down that path, I echo what Roz said. It is definitely spirituality. You know, mothers that are saying even the same thing now when people might get angry with like the riots or knife crime. It is those mothers that are either praying for their children or trying to speak life, that we don't have to go this certain type of way. So I think they're always that, you know, that role model, but they're not really celebrated as they should be, because I believe they do a lot in the community, and their stories also educate as well. When I sit down with people that have lived in the estate way longer than me, you know, the stories that they are saying, you can definitely learn from them and not make the same mistakes as them. As the Lost Blocks Collectives, we had the privilege of visiting the Black Cultural Archives and reading about farm and the riots and the things that had happened and just the different movements, because obviously the estate has changed from then. It's become, you know, they tried to separate different, you know, different buildings and stuff like that. But there was a collective youth group and the things they used to do, and just reading leaflets where they was talking about, you know, the education system. And like, you know, when I was reading, it's like they weren't saying, oh, we need to let the government do this or that. They was like, no, we are doing it ourselves. We are going to, you know, take our children and educate them ourselves. We are going to, and the wording and everything you heard. And it was like, wow, like these people were powerful. And most of the, well, what the one I read was actually particularly a Black women's magazine from the 1980s or something like that. So, and it was very demanding. It wasn't, we're not compromising. This is what we're going to do. And that inspired me. But at the same time, I was like, why was it kept so silent? Like, why didn't I know about these women already? And so those movements have been there and they have empowered us. And I believe they still empowering us, because whether it's a Black woman from the Water Farm Estate or from Brixton who'd been through all of these stuff, or even just coming from the Caribbean and even Africa, all of the stories that they have to share can help the next generation and help us to be better as a Black woman, but to, you know, anyone else who is willing to listen, you can learn, because they're strong, man. They're strong.
Fantastic. So we've got another question from our audience, from a student at UCL who's writing their dissertation on cultural institutions in Brixton. And this student asks what the panel think about the Black Cultural Archives as a monument for Black people, or a channel to speak out in a white-dominated society. What do you like? So the Black Cultural Archives is a relatively, well, as a museum, opened a few years ago. So, you know, there was a time relatively recently where there wasn't this fantastic open museum space devoted to Black culture and history in the heart of Brixton. Ross, for you, what did it mean to see the Black Cultural Archives open up as this space in the centre of Brixton and become what it is today?
Well, I was there when they started talking about the plans when they were at Cole Harbour Lane with the late Len Garrison, one of the founders. And it's important that we preserve our history, and it's important that we tell our stories, and, you know, it's important that we inspire, educate, and motivate our community. And we have to do it for ourselves. Nobody's going to do it for you. You have to encourage the next generation, the scholars, academias, all about our history, you know, all over the world. But more importantly, the Black British experience. So it is monumental and that we keep the Black Culture Archives going, contribute, whether it's in material, you know, or finance. It is our space, and, you know, we fought for that. So to me, it is what it is. Black Cultural Archives. You know, it's not about just history. It's about the past, the present, and the future.
Fantastic. Ife, I know you're having some connection problems. You're back with us.
I'm back indeed.
Fantastic, because Ross just mentioned the past, the present, and the future, and we've been talking a lot about the past. But I was wondering if you could talk maybe to us a little bit about our present and our future, because obviously you're a criminal defence barrister. You've been working with Black protest legal supports. Do you think a huge amount has changed since 1981 in relation to institutional racism in policing and the way it affects Black communities?
Well, I'm not a criminal defence barrister yet. I started in October.
Oh, sorry.
Take distance, but I will be starting my practice in October. But I do a lot of community organising, and particularly working with lawyers that are in practice under Black protest legal support. I've been able to see firsthand, particularly in terms of how things are, particularly policing protests, but also knowing firsthand from living in Brixton, growing up in Brixton, how violent policing and oppressive policing is something that is apparent and is a daily occurrence in our communities. So I think, for us, the SUS laws have, reimagined themselves and reinvented themselves under pace. So we're still seeing, big issues of racial profiling. We're seeing, constant human rights violations of people of African descent in the UK. And particularly what was concerning, which your report so well highlighted, about how the policing of the BLM protest last year were institutionally racist in terms of how the police used disproportionate use of force. We saw mounted horses at protesters, and even legal observers, particularly legal observers that were Black and brown, faced disproportionate force and aggression from the police compared to our white legal observers. So still on the ground, we're still seeing this violent policing that was apparent in the 80s. So in terms of the struggle continues, it's intergenerational. But I think what we have now is that a lot more of our injustices are being caught on camera, on video. And not saying that does ensure accountability, but it enables those who were saying that you guys are exaggerating things, or trying to brush our experiences under the carpet. They can't deny it anymore because it's in their face. So we've seen, particularly with the George Floyd movement, how important what you could call citizen journalism is, or the idea of using the phone and empowering the idea that us as the community can record our own experiences and actually broadcast to the world our injustices. So I think there's been a power shift in terms of having to wait for media to collect our stories, or having to wait for a Guardian journalist to collect our stories. We can actually go online and tell our own stories. And I think that in and of itself is changing the dynamics. And I think Black communities have always, particularly ourselves, organised our own media. We know how important it was to have the story from our lens. So you had the Race Day Collective, you had the Black Panther Party having their own newspapers, because we need to tell the story on our own terms. But we know that those means were not free. Having to go to a printer, having to go on the press, not the press, so having to get a publisher to support you is money, right? Whereas going to social media and uploading a video is free. So in terms of being able to take ownership of that space and tell our own stories, and actually take command of our stories, I think is really helping the movement. And also what I particularly like about the movement as well is that it's still transnational. So particularly when I look at the work from Race Day Collective, they were really, really big on ensuring they were Black nationalist, Pan-African. They were linking up with people in South Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Americas. There was that, cross-country sort of link up. And I think that generation were closer to the countries of origin because they were either first or second generation immigrants, so they still had connections to the islands. Whereas my generation, some of us are fourth generation, some of us have been there for quite some time, so therefore we haven't kind of lost that sort of globalized connection. But with the advent of social media and things like Black Lives Matter, I've been on panels with people in America. And before last year, I'd never been in a space where I could be in a panel with Americans or people on the African continent. What I quite like is the fact that we are really, I would almost say, rebirthing via the internet this Pan-African tradition of organizing as a collective and thinking about our struggles globally. So I think that's something that's come out of the media, and particularly come out of the lockdown. Without the lockdown, I don't think we would have had such a move to have intergenerational dialogues and transnational dialogues via the internet.
On that topic of technology as well as policing, Victoria Conran asks, and maybe Aoife, you'll be able to respond to this. You can say something about the use of facial recognition by the police. There have been over 200 cases, according to Victoria, of case of misrecognition. But I think there have been wider concerns about the use of these kinds of, we might call biometric technology, being used to police people in general, but Black communities in particular?
Yes, I think there's been a lot of work, particularly in America and some in the UK, around data for Black lives. So seeing how data is being used in a way in which it criminalizes Black people, in which what we're seeing is that the human institutionalized racism and white supremacy is being normalized in technology. So in terms of this idea that technology is supposed to be better because it's neutral, but the people that are creating these data devices are white people. The people that sit at the table are bringing their biases and embedding them into the systems and datas. So that there's been studies that show that, particularly when looking at Black people, a lot of white people don't recognize our faces very well, sometimes because of the fact that there's these stereotypes that we all look the same. So what we're seeing in terms of the technology that's being created, we're seeing technology that is reaffirming that idea that all Black people are the same. Therefore, we will not ensure that that we take into consideration different pigmentation, different levels of melanin. So I even saw, because I follow quite a lot of people that do a lot of work around data and looking at technology and racism, that said that sometimes when Black people put their hands under the waters that are electronic, often it doesn't pick up a Black hand because they haven't actually tested it with Black hands. So in terms of when they create these technologies, we are excluded from the process. Therefore, racism is embedded in these systems. So what we have is that we have normalization of criminalization of Black people, but within technology. So it's like what is already happening with humans is still happening with technology. So I think we definitely have to resist facial recognition. And I know Liberty and Big Brother have done a lot of work around ensuring that these devices are not being used because it's intrusion onto our privacy, but also it's intrusion in a way that's racist and discriminatory. So again, it's a violation of human rights. So I think there's a lot of work on the ground where people are picking up the fact that these methods of surveillance are harmful, but also they are discriminatory as well. And particularly when we was doing work on BLM, we found is that people were, after they were being forced to kettle, they were taken to a facial recognition camera and forced to have their faces scanned in order to leave the kettle. So we're seeing data weaponized as a way to control people and also to gather data for further surveillance. And we know that anything to do with further surveillance, anything that is to do with encroaching on liberties, disproportionately affects Black people because we're already racialized.
Brilliant. And as Ife mentioned, both Big Brother Watch and Liberty are doing some really great research on this if people want to find out a little bit more. Coming back to you, Ross, I was wondering if I could direct another question from the audience to you. What kind of changes do you think you would like to see with regards to police and Black communities in the UK? I mean, given your kind of vast history of experience and knowledge, what kind of changes do you think are required?
Accountability. The police need to be held to account, and we need to have open and honest dialogue between the Black community and the police. We need to have a fair mechanism to hold them to account. What we've experienced is police reports after police reports. We had the Skarma report that very little has been achieved from that in terms of recommendation. We've had the Macpherson report, very few recommendation has been achieved. So we do need to start looking at the police in terms of how it serves and protects its community, particularly the Black community. And, we have to have this honest conversation. We really need to have an overhaul. We need to look at how they're funded in terms of where's the money going, in terms of, because how is it that we're not getting the service? How is it that we're still fighting for justice? 40 years on, we're still talking about police harassment. We're talking about over-policed and underserved. We're still talking about abuse of police powers. How is it 40 years that we're still at this point? We need to sit down and have a conversation about looking at an overhaul in terms of the system, because it clearly is not working. There's no point us continuing to have the same system in place expecting something different.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Fantastic. And we've got another question from the audience. Lots of great questions coming through now. So N Klostra asks, and maybe Jasmine, you could, Jasmine or Ife, if either of you want to take this one up. What is your take on the general over-policing of Black people in Britain? So this person is thinking beyond necessarily policing with police officers, but the policing of Black people in schools, the policing of Black people who might be followed by staff in shops, the policing of Black people in maybe other areas of work or in job centres, these types of places. The way in which we see the policing of Black people in these other areas of public and social life. I don't know if Jasmine or Ife, you'd like to pick up on that one.
I'm happy to go.
I see you've both unmuted yourselves, but...
Yeah, Jasmine, you can go first because I spoke last and I can carry on after.
Cool. Go ahead, Jasmine.
You can go first if you want to.
No, go on, Jasmine, go ahead.
So what is the problem? So I feel like I had a job which was a national job at one point, and I felt like because I got to travel to different countries, you could see that, okay, it is an institutional thing, but I also feel like it is a worldwide thing, because even in different classes or caste systems, we're always at the bottom. So like, for instance, traveling to Hong Kong, where I visited my friend who was doing like mission work, you could see that they would follow us through to the shop. They used to, follow us in the shop, and she's like, oh, that's normal. That's just what they do to like us there. If we're not saved by our British accent, which would save us, or going to Costa Rica, and I was the only Black person in a big group of people, and them stopping me, again, saved by my British passport. And so you see that it's not only in the institutions, in the schools, it's not only, which is obviously, that's another thing. It's not only in the workplace, but there's cultures where being Black is also negative and frowned upon, and people look at us in a certain type of way. Even look at the coronavirus. When it came, people in China were kicking Black people out, and that to me was just like, where did it start from? Sorry, not being rude, but why are you kicking as if they bought this, But I think it's a big and it's a wider thing, and I got that obviously from traveling around, and it's the Britishness, which is obviously the whiteness that kind of saves you in those situations, because they want to hear your accent and they want to hear this because it shows maybe you have money or you can give it to them, which I found so sad. Because Africa, Caribbean, just Blackness, we're so rich in just different things that we do. So I think it's very big. I think that there are definitely things that are rising up to change people's perspective. I think there's definitely a rise in diasporas going back, creating narratives and standing strong, because obviously I'm speaking from being like a British-born Ghanaian, who they're changing the narrative. So you see a lot of celebrities going to Ghana and stuff like that. So I think that's changing. That does change some stuff of, Blackness in a way. I think education, we're trying as well. I definitely think, there's associations with Black teachers, which are coming together. And I think from everything that happened with George Floyd, I feel like people are willing to have conversations, in schools, not necessarily about that, but just about, things that happen in society. Because I didn't care. If your child is in my class, I'm telling us that we all need to work together. I had a predominantly white class. I'm like, you have to make that decision. If someone in your family says something and you feel at the age of 7 that it's not right, you tell them, because you've learned from my name's Cass, I'm not going to say it, but Mrs. Cass, that, that's not the way people are supposed to be. We're supposed to love, and this is it. And don't take on things that are wrong. So I think people are doing it in their own way. It will take time for things to change, but I do believe there's a slow but steady change. I hope I've answered the question.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Ife, what do you think about this wider conception of policing beyond the Bobby on the beat in uniform, but the way in which Black people are policed in other areas of social and public life?
Yeah, so anti-Blackness permeates all sectors of society, whether that's, in football, how we behave, we're policed if we don't score a goal, or, in terms of Black women's hair, how we are, sometimes even fired from work for coming to the workplace in our natural hair, or excluded from school for wearing our natural hair. So for being Black, we are punished for just existing as Black people. So I think, of course, liberation for Black people means liberation in all spheres of life. Yeah, so it's not going to just only be in policing. We're focusing on policing because BLM, that was the forefront. of the movement in that regard, and a lot of people are victims to police harassment, so we talk about that a lot. But in terms of all spheres of life, Black people are suffering. Yeah, so for me, I'm obviously for liberation in all spheres of our life, and I think it's particularly important because we do a lot of work in schools. We see how Black children are disproportionately excluded from school, and that how that funds the school to prison pipeline, and how that ensures that Black people are funneled into criminal justice system or criminal punishment system. So I think in order for us to think about Black liberation, we have to think about all spheres of life, or how Black women are policed when they go into the medical space, where our pain is not seen. And I think another thing that's not really spoken about, because we do a lot of work around mental health, is the trauma of racism. So racial trauma, particularly looking at how racial discrimination affects mental health and actually worsens mental health. So I think it's important as well to not forget violence occurs in so many ways, both physical and mental violence, that can have a toll on the body, and how the Black person is able to thrive, and racial wellness. So particularly for me, all these attacks on Blackness really affect us as a people and don't allow us to be our full selves. So I think it's particularly important that we are able to articulate what is happening to us, but also work towards destroying the systems that make us unwell. And I think what I was reading quite recently by a Black psychologist, talking about how activism is a form of wellness for Black people, because it allows us to actively reimagine and recreate society that serves us, and actually that in and of itself is something that can help our wellness. That, alongside other forms of activities as well, and taking part in Black cultural heritage, is a way to help us be well in a system that is, attacking us and has been attacking us for over 400 years. So my take is, obviously we've got to bring systems down, but I think, yes, we need technology and speak about it more. But I also wanted to really highlight the toll on our mental health, and that is also violence as well. So I think that people being able to work towards spaces where we can be mentally well and destroy these systems that oppress us is obviously a way in which we can promote Black liberation as well. So I wanted to bring in that concept of racial trauma as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we've now got a question directed specifically to both Ross and Ife, which is about what are your views on defunding, from Jay Jagney. And I assume that means defunding the police. So for people who aren't familiar with this concept, it's basically an idea which emerges from the observation that we've seen a massive expansion in police and prisons over the last 20 or 30 years. The prison population has about doubled since the 1990s, but not really any improvements in community safety. And what defunding the police argues is that actually more and more funding for the police isn't going to make people safer, and what should instead be funded are things that can be preventative rather than punitive. So keep people safe before crime happens, rather than punishing people after crime has happened. So things like mental health provision, youth services, secure housing, good jobs, access to further and higher education, support for survivors of domestic violence or child abuse, support for people with addiction problems, a whole swathe of kind of social forms of social and community investment, which can help people before they come into contact with the criminal justice system. So that question is directed to Ross and Ife. Maybe we'll start with you, Ross. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, defunding the police, and you've got a position or thoughts on it.
Yes, I'm all about prevention, because we have to start looking at the root causes why people find themselves on the wrong side of the law. We need resources, because when you look at the underserved communities that are affected by the over-policing, they're under-resourced in terms of running the necessary preventative initiatives. So when you are investing all your time and resource into funding the police to enforce the law and lock people up, that doesn't actually make us safe. What we need to do is start to invest in the root causes, to root that out, to start looking at the supplementary education, looking at initiatives, youth service, things that will prevent them from going down the wrong path. So I'm 100% into having that conversation, a real honest and open conversation that we need to organize around that specific ideology that we need to start to look towards change in terms of how the police is funded. because we cannot just continue to keep putting money into a system that's failing us and not serving us, not protecting us. We don't trust it. We have no confidence. Why we keep plowing money into a system that is failing us? We just got to have an open and honest conversation where we need to realign these resources. But we need to explain to the wider community what we mean by defunding the police. We don't mean take away all their funding. What we're saying is let's look at it and how the funds are being allocated so that we can focus on the needs. And the need is to start to look at the underserved communities, look at what is needed, more youth prevention initiative, more preventative measures. Get the community to be at the table. So when we're looking at the design of community safety, they're at the table, they're at the design stage. They're part of the implementation and they're part of the evaluation. We need to have that conversation. We need to organize around that. We cannot continue to be going down this route of, policing and more policing and locking people up, because that is no deterrent.
Cool. And Ife, the question was directed to you as well. I don't know if you have something you'd like to add.
Yeah, it's the fun to abolish around here, to be honest. So for me, particularly, we've seen the history of policing, but also we need to remember there was a time police never existed. But because it seems that the norm now, we can't really imagine society without police. And I think particularly over the lockdown, just before the lockdown, I was exposed to the work of Miriam Keba, and the way she articulates, particularly around abolition, and how that will help free Black people, but also to create a better society where people's needs are met, and why our police budget is so big, yet people are not safe. So it's actually kind of thinking about, for what we put into policing, what are we getting out of it? And why does policing remain so harmful to our communities? But also, there's some people that can't call the police. And there's this notion that people believe that everyone can call the police and the police is helpful and, it's officer friendly, you've got a lot of propaganda going on. But it's actually not true to the reality that a lot of Black people can't call the police. When I was a youth worker, there was a time when a young person called us and was like, oh, they're fearing for their lives. And they didn't call the police, they called their youth workers. Obviously, because we haven't been funded to the stage where youth workers can be the first point of call or first responders, we couldn't say, okay, we can come and help you. We had to direct you to the police because that's all we have right now. But it's about thinking about what resources do we currently have? Why can't we ensure that spaces that keep people safe, like youth workers, like mental health workers, are the first point of call when someone's in a time of stress? Like, why has the police been expanded to be the number one person to respond to all areas, whether that's working with children, whether that's people that are mentally ill, and they're not trained to do that. They haven't gone through years of studying to know how to relate to people that are going through mental health crisis. So why are they the first point of call? So it's about thinking about why is it so many times where Black men are having psychotic episodes or episodes where they are mentally unwell, when the police come involved, they then end up dying in police custody after recent contact with the police. So it's about thinking about, who does the police keep safe? Why did our community keeps being harassed and victim to state violence from the police? And how can we reimagine a society where Black people's needs are met, where Black people are liberated, where Black people can live in communities of safety? And what we often find is when the police turn up to instances, it's almost when the problem's already happened or when the incident's already taken place, so they don't actually provide safety. And what a lot of people think that they are safe because the police are around, but police don't necessarily do that. So I think it's kind of reimagining what is safety and thinking about what do our communities want and what do our communities need, and how, if our communities were better served with the money that goes into police budget, how we could actually provide safety for each other and get to know each other more.
Fantastic, brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, so I've got a question, another question from the audience, this time for you, Jasmine. So Jasmine, what are your thoughts about the capacity of Black British communities to bring about social change for protests today? Do you think that the community infrastructure that we have and the organising that we have and the kind of protests that Black communities have been engaging in, do you think they have the capacity, or what are your thoughts about the capacity to bring about change? Do you see change on the horizon?
Definitely, yes, I do. I think you see it in different ways, like we've said before. You see it in communities get, like, you see in the music, because music really inspires, as Roz was saying, like Bob Marley's music, and you listen to certain types of music when you're feeling a certain type of way, even Stormzy, you know, certain things. So I definitely think that that is helping people, and I feel like people are protesting definitely in their own way. So you have petitions that I've been seeing going around with teachers, different communities. So we're trying, you know, the whole petition things, and also people walk in the streets. So I know that we talked about it being a lot of like to do with Americans and everything that's happening. But I know that when we even do the movement here, I still think we get a response and we raise awarenesses. I know that there's awareness of like, if you've been watching the BBC and following that, they've talked about like how Black women are treated when they're giving birth. So just things like that. And I feel like even though it's just the BBC program, it's still a type of like protest. You're raising awareness. Why are these, you know, Black women dying, giving birth in proportion to other people from different races? Then, you know, Church of England, when that whole came out about, you know, how Black ministers are treated, that's something. So I definitely feel like there is definitely a movement that is, you know, we're being able to tell our stories and seeing that, okay, why is it happening in the medical field? It's also happening in this field. It's happening here. Okay, something's not right. Why are these particular people always being treated, whether it's policing, whether it's in schools, always it seems to be like they're trying to be suppressed still, as if they haven't been through enough. So I do feel like obviously that's happening, and it's protesting, but in a different way. We're not all walking the streets. Social media as well. You know, when everyone put that Black post up, I think it gives awareness, and it also creates conversations, because you might have someone that is, you know, maybe they're not around a lot of Black people. They don't actually understand what's going on. Because I remember going to a job and the woman was like, oh, racism, is that still a thing? I looked at her like, what planet do you live on? But she seriously asked that question, because if you're not around that community, you might think, oh, it's a thing in the past. So as I was saying, I think we're protesting, even if it's not, you know, to walk down the streets and the government change stuff, it still brings those conversations, which I think are good as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Oh, sorry, Ross, did you want to add something on? Are you on mute, Ross? You're on mute.
I think it's important that we protest, but that's only part of the journey.
Yeah.
We have to move from protest to action, because there's so many of us like to march up and down and you know, pop bang in. That's good, but the real work is about the action. So protest to mobilize, mobilize to organize. Nothing happens until you organize. That's what it's about. And we need to learn from the past, accept where we're at, and plan the way forward. And I am about passing the baton on to the next generation about action. It's not talking shop and explaining, and you know, we've done all of that. What we need is action. Get the strategy. What are we focusing on? We have, in my days, it was about self-interest. That's the past. The future is common interest. We come together for a common interest. When you agree on that, we have to have a strategy. We need to know who's on the front line, who's in the strategy room, and we're not stopping until we see movement. We're going to have a movement when we get things happening. We can't just be about protests and marching up and down, pop banging outside of 10 Downing Street, raising our voices. We're eloquent speakers. We've done all of that. We've been doing that. We've got to move it to action. And action means a strategy. And that's what I'm about. It's about me working with people who are who think for a common cause. That's what's going to move us forward. But we have to leave self-interest aside. That's the part. We know where we're at. It's where we're trying to get to. Young people, I have the millennials, I have confidence, because I think technology has changed the landscape. Back in my days, it was word of mouth. No, we didn't have social media. We had just walk around and, you know, so technology, we need to use it. We've got our brothers and sisters globally through technology. There's nothing stopping us. Yes, nothing. So I am optimistic if we're very clear about our strategy. When you've got the Marcus Rashford, it lifts my spirit and restores my confidence in the movement. He has 11 million followers. That's influence. Yes, we're supposed to be tapping into that. And these young people who's savvy with this technology. We've got great intellects who are like Adam and everybody else. We've got so much talent amongst us. We just need to maximize on it. We didn't have that 40 years ago, or it was in limited supply. Yes, so I think that we're in a great opportunity to move things. I want to see a movement, not just protests and pop. You know, I want to see movement, and I think that we're at a tipping point. We're at a tipping point. So it's important for me to share my story. We've been here before. We don't need to go back there. We need to move forward. How we're going to move forward? By doing things differently. And it's about those who are ready to stand. We need to support each other. Education, housing. If people look like us, support them. Put your money where your mouth is. Turn up, show up, and make a stand. And you know, because we've got so much that we've contributed to this country, and we're not backing down. I'm not expecting the generation like my son. He's 21. He's not me. He would do it differently. So, as I wasn't my parent. So,
yeah.
You know, so the next generation, I have all confidence. The millennials, we want to see leaders, and we have to have strategies that produce more leaders, that create more leaders. That's the kind of movement you're going to get Ross Griffis interested in. Nothing
Fantastic,
else will do.
fantastic. Okay, so we've got some comments from the audience. I'm just going to read out very quickly. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman has said that we're rebirthing our Pan-African connections via the internet. Love that. And Ligali has said that engaging activism as a practice of social wellness is a really powerful idea. I think referring to something that Ife said earlier. Thank you for sharing. Afrophobia causes so much trauma, both mentally and physically. And Victoria Conran is drawing our attention to Ken Farrow's new film, Ultraviolence, which reveals the containment strategy used by various state agencies, resulting in only 2 police officers being convicted out of over 2,000 deaths in police custody, with lots of families campaigning for decades without justice. So I want to end today's brilliant conversation with one last question, which is also from Ligali. And I want to go around and have each of you answer this question from Ligali to close this evening's event. The question from Ligali is, how do the panel collectively define liberation? What is the most important area of policing that needs changing for our community to thrive and be safe? But we've kind of touched on that already. So I think I'd like everyone just to focus on that first bit of Ligali's question. How do you define for yourself, or how do you envisage liberation? It's a big question, isn't it? Who wants to go first? Who's got an idea? I see you nodding, Roz.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't just sum it up in one word, but it is about we have to stand for something, or we fall for anything. We have to hold this institution to account. Ask the right questions. We have to turn up, and we have to be about the common interest. They're there to support, protect, and serve. If we don't have confidence in them, we need to tell them straight plain, we don't have confidence in you. You're not serving us. You underserve us. We're not getting a service. Liberation to me is that I need to feel that I am treated equally, not gone off and I have to be angry about the service that I'm paying into, you know. So it is about having that honest and open conversation, sitting at the table, designing the menu, eating from the menu. We're not going to accept nothing less. It's not good enough to be at the table, because that's where we've been. We've been at the table, but we haven't designed the menu and we haven't ate from the menu. Yes? So to me, it's when I'm participating, I'm part of the design, and I'm part of the implementation, and I'm part of the evaluation. That to me is the cycle, and it's a process. Don't call me when you want me to solve the problems that you created. I'm not here. I'm tired. I don't want to be explaining anything anymore. Things have to change. We want to be part of change. We want to have a better place to live and feel safe for our children and our children's children. That's what we want to see. That's what liberation looks like to me. It's about equality for all. We have to be at the table. We don't want to come to just because we look the part or we're doing a tick box exercise. No, we need to have an open and honest conversation about the process. Clearly, it's not working and it hasn't been working for some time. Yes? So let's stop pretending and let's call it out for what it is. Yes? And you need to respect us as experts that are coming to make a difference, equal to your commissioners and what have you. We're here to tell you that we're here to work this thing out, but in terms of the design. So I think that liberation is when I am treated equally. I'm at the table, eating off the menu, and not just being invited to the table. And we need to be implementing it, evaluating it, and we start the whole process again. So everybody knows that it's transparent, it's clear, and it's justice for all, and not just the few.
Fantastic. Jasmine, what does liberation mean to you?
Like, I think when things are ruled like with love, and I think that comes from working obviously with children and young people, but not regardless of the race or people, like everybody is different. When a police officer has an encounter with every person, no matter how no matter where they come from, just see like that person, that situation is different and things can surprise you. I think when you try and you put a group of people in one frame, that's where the problems come. So I think is understanding that people are people, and I think liberation is where everybody's seen as, obviously we're collective because we have things in common, but we're also different. So I can have an experience with one person, doesn't mean I have experience with all people the same way. I hope you understand. And I'm referring to like the police and stuff like that in society, not having those misconceptions or those, prejudice, but actually taking people that they are people, showing that love. And I think, liberation is when we just genuinely have love for each other. We actually care about each other. I can't say that someone might understand where I come from, living in an estate, a community. Like they might not be able to understand everything I go through, but at least, be willing to listen when I speak and actually be there because you care, not just because, as Ross said, you have to tick a box or you feel sorry or you want to prove that you're not a certain type of way, but you really don't actually care, because the movement and the action comes from other people that are outside of the race when they actually care. So I think, it just boils down to love for me and having that deep thing in, which you don't see because many people can go and protest and do all these things, but just want to seem a certain type of way, don't want to, they actually, when they're in the workplaces, it shouldn't only be a Black person trying to fight their case or stuff. And I've heard many people from different races, they might see it, but they don't speak. But if that was you or your child, you would speak. So it is having that love there. And I think liberation is when we all have that love and we all, fight together because we genuinely care about each other.
Brilliant. And Ife, liberation.
Yeah, so for me, when I think of the word liberation, I'm thinking of a world free of oppression and anti-Blackness. And I'm thinking of a world that has no more white supremacy. I'm also thinking of a world where principles, from Pan-Africanism, Black feminist theory, abolitionist theory, are in practice and are the norm. So for me, a world where Black people are free and liberated is a world where we have all of our needs adhered to, but also we're able to thrive because we are Black. So I think, economically, historically as well, I think undoing historical harms is particularly important. So reparation, all the kind of things I think have to be centered, and thinking about creating a society that's more equitable, that really looks at the harm done by empire by slavery, by anti-blackness, and actually is undoing all of that, and actually just having a place where people can thrive and thrive with their blackness. So I think for me, it's a world where there's reparations in all spheres and a guarantee of non-recurrence, and also that redistribution of wealth. So all that wealth hoarding is gone, and we all have equitable access to wealth, and we can thrive as a people. So I think he's been able to really fulfill your purpose and destiny, and also to be in love with one another and all of those things as well. But I think particularly ridding the world of racism, capitalism, and all of the ills that continue to make us unwell.
Okay, so constructing the menu, eating at the table, love and reparations. Those are the take-home messages from today's event. I just want to thank Roz, Jasmine and Ife for a really enriching, inspiring conversation. Thank you so much for your time this evening. I want to thank our audience for your questions, your comments, your participation. And of course, I want finally to thank the Black Cultural Archives for putting together this really crucial and important event to not only remember our histories, but of course also to look forward to our futures. So thank you all very much and enjoy your evenings.